the sophistication in general is now being amplified dramatically. Even before the advent of AI, if I don't know how to change out my leaky faucet, well, I can go YouTube it and I can figure it out. So the tools that are available to people to become more sophisticated and self-sufficient and educated about the thing that they're embarking upon are just light years ahead of where they've ever been in our history. Now you layer AI on top of that, and almost real-time ability to interrogate and get feedback on any given topic. Yeah, you got to be bringing your A game. You've got to assume that you have a sophisticated buyer. They've got the benefit of, whether it be OpenAI or Copilot or Claude or whatever else. They're not calling you without having a pretty good lay of the land about what the market is and what the competitive pressures are. All of the data points that have been synthesized down. Forget Gartner anymore. I mean, I can get the same value out of a Gartner report in 35 seconds with a well-written prompt. So your buyer is a lot more educated, a lot more sophisticated, and you gotta be still one step ahead of them. So the bar is raised all the way around the horn. Hi, this is Jon Billow with BNS. You're watching the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast.
Hi, it's Joshua Feinberg, host of the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast. Joining me today is Jon Billow, who is CEO and CRO of BNS in Portland, Oregon. Jon, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Great to have you here as well. So just to provide a little bit of context, can you help our audience to understand a little bit how BNS fits into the broader data center ecosystem and what your main areas of focus are?
Yeah, so our angle on things really is full lifecycle management. Builds and manufactures the medium and low voltage electrical switchgear that is deployed both in about 150 Navy ships around the world, but we've pivoted that into the data center since it's literally exactly the same voltage and configuration of the gear that everybody's deploying there. The network side of our business deals with the communication infrastructure, and so we're doing all of the physical build of the white space and gray space, both from the structured cabling for Ethernet as well as massively dense fiber optic meshes. Now everything being AI, we've gotten into some fairly insane levels of complexity and density. We do all the cabinets, all of the VESDA, all of the overhead conveyance, basically everything that you need in order to get your environment up and running. We then manage the environment for customers on an ongoing basis. And when the equipment gets a little bit long in the tooth, you want to migrate, you want to upgrade to the latest and greatest whiz-bang, Vera Rubin GPUs. We will do data sanitization, provide fair market value for the deprecated equipment, and help swap it out for the new latest and greatest gear.
So you're really involved in a very holistic part of client engagement, both on the facility side, especially with power and transformers, and then on the telecommunication side with cabling, connectivity, as well as asset disposition.
100%. Yep.
Very interesting full life cycle approach to all this. I imagine over time that's resulted in a very specific kind of client that appreciates that.
Yeah, I mean, yes, it has, but that client is becoming more genericized over the years, right? So, everything in the enterprise has exactly the same requirements. It's just a matter of the scale and the complexity. But at the end of the day, we're still building out the same general kinds of environments for the hyperscalers and the neoclouds that are putting in a 16,000 node GPU clusters. The basic tenets and success criteria and design considerations are all the same as working with an insurance company putting in a rack of regular old Dell servers. So yeah, the world's changed and there's some specificity there, but that specificity really is around how to build out best in class critical infrastructure to support mission critical operations.
You mentioned just a few moments ago the challenges of differentiating and avoid being placed into more generic categories. Is that what you see right now as the biggest go-to-market challenge facing firms like BNS, or is it something else?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things. I mean, one of the biggest challenges, of course, is that we're now in a world where skilled trade labor is the most valuable commodity, if you will. That's kind of the limiting, theory of constraints, limiting factor. So if you've got a licensed electrician on staff, that's a person you really want to work on retaining. Um, so that's probably one of the biggest challenges. The kind of competitive, diversification, if you will, is going to be it's going to be there, but especially with a lot of the technologies drifting towards liquid cooled environments, drifting towards these very, very highly complex, highly dense AI GPU farms. There's a lot of differentiation just in having experience at scale that it's very hard to reproduce.
When you look at the last 2 to 3 years, especially, and all the changes that have come about as generative AI has become more mainstream, how has that impacted your plans in growing BNS? Pretty much every firm across operators and tech and facilities is talking about becoming AI ready, or that they are ready or are AI ready, but the high density AI is completely different power and cooling and network configurations. How much of this AI market is actually closable pipeline right now versus people that are just making kind of tire kicking noise about wanting to make significant investments in AI?
Well, it really depends on the segmentation you're talking about. So what we're seeing is you've got your classic, colocation operators, the Flexentials, Digital Realty, QTS Stack, all of those guys are seeing huge demand, but they're primarily dealing with legacy facilities that don't have the power density, don't have the cooling capabilities. And so they're very, very stranded in terms of their resources and ability to move with the market. So they're furiously building as quick as they can because their lack of ability to service that market has literally been what's led to the advent of the neoclouds, right? So the neoclouds are basically building up these purpose-built facilities. Effectively, it's AWS that's purpose-built just for AI. They're building them with the power density. They're building them from the ground up to support the new use cases, and their ability to bring with it the operational maturity that the traditional operators already have is kind of their challenge. But we're seeing the market basically stratify into different tiers to meet the demand that really can't be met by any individual legacy player in the field, or really any of the new players either, because it boils down to a lot of the same constraints. You need access to the power, you need to have the power generation many times behind the meter. Now you've got to have the allocation of the infrastructure. You've got to have the operational maturity. It's all got to come together into a solution path for customers that's holistic and meets the need. So customers in general are absolutely pushing for AI solutions. You can't be a cool company if you don't have an AI story. But the way that companies are implementing that has everything to do with where they are in the maturity curve, where they're at with their capex capabilities to be able to buy versus rent capacity from providers that are out there. So I think everybody's kind of crafting their own story, and they're all trying to figure out what it means and how they can monetize it and how they can add value related to it. And that's why you're seeing the market really starting to stratify, because you're starting to see different solutions come about that match the different market demands that are out there from more of the consumer, of the enterprise consumer, if you will.
Let's talk for a few moments about the enterprise consumer versus the colo versus the neocloud. And in particular, I want to learn a little bit more about who your ideal clients are, who usually shows up on decision committee. We've seen the last several years, especially because of Gen AI now, that people are doing so much more research on their own before they get to you. It feels like they have almost like an MBA, PhD level of education in buying data center services many times before they get to you. What do you want different kinds of stakeholders to know about what BNS does before they ever get to that initial meeting?
I think the more sophisticated the customer, the better all the way around. I mean, there's a degree of complexity with how these systems work. There's a degree of complexity in terms of the care and feeding and how to run them, day two from an operational perspective. That if you don't do your homework and you're not really aware and you make assumptions about, well, running a AI factory, a token factory is going to basically be the same thing as running my Oracle database cluster, then you're not going to staff it right. You're not going to size it right, and you're gonna have some real challenges downstream, and that's gonna come out in terms of the partners that you pick. What you do as far as your where you're going to host it, how you're going to host it, who's going to build it, how it's going to be supported. It'll permeate all the way through. So I think kind of people being really clear-eyed in terms of where their core competency is, what they feel like they need to provide in the design, build, engineering, support stack, and what components of it they aren't really well suited for and really should be outsourcing. That kind of clarity, I think, is really key to have the kind of outcome that everybody's looking for. The worst thing you can do is kind of have this delusion about what your core competencies are and come into it, thinking that it's going to work out this way because you read an article, and 6 months later, whole thing's in tatters and you don't know why.
One of the challenges that we hear across the data center ecosystem is deal stalling, and a lot of times deal stalling because there's a lack of alignment on education and there doesn't seem to be enough trust. What have you found to be especially effective for your firm in being able to establish that trust before you ever get to the first meeting?
Well, I guess it depends on where you see that originating. I mean, for the most part, I think a lot of that sausage making, if you will, is already done by our customers before they come to us. So we tend to find that they're pretty well aligned. We're not going to necessarily be involved with a conversation between a end consumer and a Neocloud or a comparable to like an AWS, right? Because it's a pure consumption model. The customer's not having to deal with any infrastructure investment or anything like that. It's just turn the spigot on from an OpEx perspective. So I think those are the scenarios where you get into a lot of that decisions, start, stop. What are we really trying to do? How's it really supposed to work? And we're shielded from most of that because everything that we do is at the infrastructure level. So you're not engaging with us unless we're building for the operator or we're building physical infrastructure for the consumer, in which case they've already gone through a lot of these gates. Because if you're an enterprise customer and you have concerns about AI sovereignty, and therefore you're going to build your own, and you found a facility that's got the capabilities to support it, you're into a 7, 8, 9-figure investment, and you've thought it through, and you've got a lot of these things already figured out before you ever come knock on our door.
So that's a really interesting perspective. It's the nature of the services that in your specialization that's made it possible for you to deal with a much more sophisticated buyer.
Yeah, because it's not like you can get into this for $150 a month through AWS, just sort of turn it on. I mean, you can, and then you deal with AWS, right? You don't deal with us at all. But there's a minimum mark. You can't really deploy AI in any kind of meaningful way, even inference AI in any kind of meaningful way, without a pretty significant investment, and that brings with it all of the scrutiny and all of the governance and gating and everything else that I think you're alluding to with enterprise customers. Well, they've got that all figured out before the CFO is willing to write a $10 million check to build it.
It's kind of like the extreme opposite example of like a local managed service provider or cloud services provider that's dealing with small and medium-sized businesses that may not even have in-house IT. You're at the other extreme. You're looking at very well capitalized, in many cases, public or private equity companies that have tons of infrastructure to have really solid roadmaps before they're ever getting to that first conversation with you.
Well, at the very least, the dollar figures are large enough that there is a degree of due diligence that's required for them to have a pretty good sense of what they're about to embark upon. I'm not sure that anybody in this day and age, especially with AI moving as fast as it is, I'm not sure they necessarily have it entirely figured out when they decide to move into it, because there's definitely kind of a FOMO thing going on as well. So time beats a lot of other considerations, but again, it is pretty well gated by the entry fee.
John, I want to talk for a few minutes about the process you went through in the merger, marrying the two companies together. What did you find was especially challenging with go-to-market friction and integration with bringing those two playbooks together, and what's ultimately ended up becoming your most effective playbook for going to market in the data center industry?
Well, so I've done quite a bit of M&A. Sphaera, the company that I built, was my fourth startup. So I'd done this personally 3 times before, and one of the first ones that I did, way back in the day, the company that I joined, I ended up doing a lot of M&A. It was a roll-up, so I did a whole bunch of M&A after I got acquired to basically, turn it into a playbook and execute over and over again. So I had a reasonable amount of experience walking into it to kind of know where some of the pitfalls were. In our particular case, we had been working with BNS for 5 years prior to the acquisition, and so I've known the chairman of the company, Lou, very well. Actually, their CFO was my CFO for a period of time. We had been working together very, very closely for the years leading up to the acquisition. So operationally, we knew how to work with their staff, our staff. Go to market was already really defined and already in place. Literally, the point where we completed the acquisition, it was more just about realizing financial gains, because we weren't trying to margin stack between two different organizations and duplicating two different sets of overhead. But we were operationally, we're already pretty well ingrained, and we already had more or less a playbook for kind of a joint go-to-market approach. So it was a very unique situation compared to a lot of M&A. And it really, because of the way we did it, you could consider it kind of like a 5-year due diligence period. I mean, we really de-risked the whole thing for a very, very long time, before we kind of consummated the deal.
It's really fascinating to see how it almost developed organically rather than going out and proactively looking for
It did. 100%.
a deal.
100%. Yep. Yeah, and it kind of emanated with with the leadership team of BNS had done a couple of strategic acquisitions. They had the tiger by the tail with some really, really lucrative customer projects, but they didn't have the field staff to be able to do the execution and delivery on. We were kind of the opposite. We built out our field capabilities, and we had a lot of account concentration with a few number of customers. So the kind of the SWOT analysis lined up really well between the organizations, and yeah, we had a lot of time to kind of figure out what our cadence was in our operating model before we actually threw one logo on the t-shirt.
Yeah, really, really interesting best practice with all of that. John, when you look at your peers locally, regionally, nationally, other sales leaders, CROs, do you see anything across outbound or digital marketing or events that you see companies still throwing millions at annually that just doesn't seem to be working anymore, and they're just kind of in denial about?
Honestly, I don't have the luxury of taking a look a lot at those kind of metrics through the lens of my peers. I guess I don't think so. I think if anything, the larger, more established organizations have made investments in marketing and comms that are a little bit out of date now, especially again from a consumer perspective. Taking advantage of AI has been something that we've done, internal to the company a lot. In particular, related to outbound and inbound demand gen and marketing and comms programs and things like that. So if anything, and again, I don't have a lot of firsthand experience from talking to peers, but my gut would be that everybody's at some stage along the continuum of either doing what they've been doing for years with kind of the classic channels and the classic go-to-market approach that they've always been using, all the way through to kind of revamping the whole thing to take advantage of the new capabilities that are out there. Everyone's probably at a different place in that journey, but there's nothing in particular that jumps out at me that's like, oh my God, I can't believe these guys are doing fill in the blank, this, that, or the other thing.
Most data center GTM teams are flying completely blind. 83% of your buyer's journey is happening before they even speak with someone from your sales team. The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is powered by DCSMI. We've studied over 1,900 industry leaders to build a diagnostic framework that identifies exactly why deals fall apart and revenue stalls. Stop guessing and start benchmarking. Subscribe now to our weekly Data Center GTM briefing at www.dcsmi.com/briefing. Again, that's dcsmi.com/briefing, BRIEFING. We hear across a lot of different parts of the industry frustration that CROs aren't getting the return on investment from technical content marketing like they'd hope for. A lot of what we think is going on has to do with creating content specifically for engineers. And a lot of times the engineers are not the ones that are the ultimate decision makers. They're on the committee, but they aren't ultimately the ones that get the project across the finish line. Why have you found technical content to fail to convert to raw revenue? And what would you do to approach it a little bit differently?
For us, it's a little bit, well, it's a bit of a bifurcated answer. So technical content for us is more of a sales tool, mostly to establish credibility that the thing that we're offering withstands an engineering review. It's a solid design. It makes good sense. It got a good product market fit. Kind of profile to it. But it really is more of a check the box credibility kind of a thing, and I don't see deals either happening or not happening because of that. That's more on the network side of the business, the data center, the AI kind of side of the business. The other side of the business, though, where we do a lot of work with the military and with a couple of key channels related to our electrical switchgear, that's a very, very different segment, and that level of technical content is highly scrutinized. There's still a high degree of value placed on those estrals and cedrils that the engineers need to have, fully vetted and fully documented. A high degree of value placed on them, and the quality of them is absolutely, part of what's evaluated for kind of a, have you hit the marks, kind of a thing. So you can't. I can't emphasize enough that it's completely bipolar opposite depending on what segment we're talking about for our company.
Have you found that to be especially challenging? It sounds like at the absolute minimum that it's two different sets of personas, but has there ever been a time
100%.
where it's really almost needs to be two separate brands because the nature of the business is so different?
I mean, we run it as BNS Power and BNS Network. So to that extent, it is kind of branded separately. There is not currently a lot of overlap in terms of the customer base. There is a huge amount of potential overlap in terms of the product line. The electrical switchgear that they put on Navy ships is the same voltage as data centers, and so there's a large ability for us to kind of cross sell the product between the customer base. But the positioning of it is very different. The technical documentation is extremely different. The personas are very different. The buyers, the segments, the sectors, the trade shows we go to, everything is very different. And that manifests in how, if you look at our website, it literally forks you immediately. You want to talk about BNS Power, go here, BNS Networks, go there. And all of the content is dramatically different, all the way down to things like referenceable customers. I mean, obviously, even with AI and data center infrastructure, there is a large degree of concern about privacy, and not all of our customers are referenceable publicly. But I can tell you that the number of customers that I can reference in terms of case studies and white papers for the networks team, is 10 to 1 to the number of government projects that I can reference publicly.
And even in the US, data center operators are a pretty secretive group at times. We found even big differences with this podcast. It's far easier to host data center operators on a podcast like this from outside the US than from within the US. So I think there's almost like a intelligence grade playbook going on among, I don't want to say paranoid marketing teams, but overly cautious, overly conservative teams that want to almost have something editorial be advertorial or hold up cue cards or be able to edit something. I don't know exactly what it is, but we're seeing just about enough data now to see some pretty significant differences between within the US and outside the US for preferences on things like thought leadership and webinars and podcasting.
Interesting. Yeah, I can't really comment as much on that other than I can tell you that, of course, everybody's got their own brand, and part of their brand identity and what they're trying to communicate with that has got a lot to do with kind of how you're positioning and what you talk about and don't talk about. The extreme example would be, an operator like Switch data centers that, literally part of their brand is that their security guards are rolling around in, side by side utility vehicles with M16s at their hip, wearing all black tactical gear. It's part of their brand. It's part of what they're trying to put out there, is that, everything that they do is so secured, and and confidentiality is so critical to them that, it is literally part of their identity and the brand that they're actively trying to promote. Not all of them are built that way, but I do think there's an element of that I'm not sure that it is a cultural U.S. versus the Europe or the rest of the world kind of a thing, as much as it is the brand positioning of the individual operators.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Jon, it sounds like you've had quite a bit of experience with running sales organizations. I imagine mentoring sales hires over the years. What do you see sales teams consistently get wrong about understanding data center buyers?
You're not selling a SKU out of a catalog. It is a complex sale. You've got to really understand the customer. You've got to really understand the technology. Every one of our customers, every one of our projects, even in well, period, they're all unique. They're all snowflakes. There's unique attributes. As much as you try and get it into a standard kind of an offering, standard kind of an operating model, there are still unique characteristics, and it's not the kind of world where you can have people who don't really understand the buyer's technical requirements, business requirements. It's a sophisticated buyer. It is a complex sale. It's a complex solution path, especially right now where every part of the supply chain is so massively impacted. There are a lot of really complicated factors that come into timelines and quote duration. How long is my quote good for? And every aspect of it is really formed by the underlying technology and solution that we're providing. So it is not the kind of thing where you can bring in entry level, non-sophisticated salespeople and point them in a brochure and point them at a catalog and go sell the products off the back of the truck. This does not work at all.
Yeah, it's fascinating that you brought that up, because over the last couple of years, I've noticed that starting with the data center operators and tech companies, there's been a lot more initiative for account executives and sales development reps to upskill. Sometimes it starts with just looking at what kind of training and certifications their core personas have and making sure that they get at least some of those so they can have better conversations. I see a lot more of exactly what you were just describing, where a lot of CROs and CEOs of smaller companies are hiring career IT professionals and career engineers who've never worked on a revenue organization before to become kind of the IT person in residence or the engineer person in residence to have credibility when they go out on sales appointments. Obviously fantastic for hosting their own events. As we see a lot of the hyperscalers even realign, there was an announcement from Microsoft a couple of weeks ago about a big change and sales people exiting the organization, but at the same time aggressively hiring on engineers. Are you seeing a lot of that trend where it seems like there's a lot more people being hired for these specialty roles like engineering degrees and IT backgrounds without necessarily having that sales experience because it's the only way that they're getting a foot in the door now?
Yeah, I do. I mean, for what we do, I can only speak to our particular place in the world, and that is that it is always has been, I believe always will be, a very relationship oriented sales activity, right? So you've got to have the interpersonal skills. You've got to develop the relationships with your customers. You've got to understand what it is that they're looking for. but you got to do that in the context of actually understanding what the heck it is that that they're buying, that we're offering, and you got to be able to carry the conversation, pretty far before you turn around and hand it off to a sales engineer. So definitely, I think you gotta have a fairly sophisticated sales force at this point. I don't think the industry, our view of it anyway, is that it is not really conducive to that kind of frontline, inside sales, 50 people in a sweat room, kind of a thing anymore. It's just no diminishing marginal returns for sure on that.
Yeah, it seems like we've been hearing for a couple of years already, there's not much of a role for someone that reads the website or reads slides to people anymore, because
No.
content marketing and YouTube and everything figured that out a couple of years ago. So now it's a matter of, can your sales team provide more value than they can get from having a conversation with Copilot or Claude or something like that?
Well, and you mentioned that, and that's the other really important thing, is that the sophistication in general is now being amplified dramatically. I mean, even before the advent of AI, if I don't know how to change out my leaky faucet, well, I can go YouTube it and I can figure it out. So the tools that are available to people to become more sophisticated and self-sufficient and educated about the thing that they're embarking upon are just light years ahead of where they've ever been, in our history. Now you layer AI on top of that, and almost real-time ability to interrogate and get feedback on any given topic. You got to be bringing your A game. You've got to assume that you have a sophisticated buyer. They've got the benefit of, whether it be OpenAI or Copilot or Claude or whatever else. They're not calling you without having a pretty good lay of the land about what the market is and what the competitive pressures are. All of the data points that have been synthesized down. Forget Gartner anymore. I mean, I can get the same value out of a Gartner report in 35 seconds with a well written prompt. So your buyer is a lot more educated, a lot more sophisticated, and you gotta be still one step ahead of them. So the bar is raised all the way around the horn.
When it comes to providing value and educating and building trust with multi-stakeholder committees, we see a lot of times CROs and their teams struggling to get access to the full decision committee and the actual decision makers. What have you found to be especially effective at making sure that you have enough surface area in a particular account to be successful, not only in getting the deal over the finish line, but making sure that you're aligned on everything that's core importance, so post-purchase, everything goes well?
Being completely unabashed about answering or asking the questions, right? Get the lay of the land, understand who's on this committee to begin with, understand who are the stakeholders, official and unofficial, understand who the influencers are in the organization that aren't going to necessarily pop out on the org chart, but it's the guy sitting in the back of the room that everybody's actually listening to. Doing that intel and really getting to know your audience, right? Know the crowd, know what your buying profile is, your buyer's profile is, know what the organization is. The more time you spend up front figuring that out, the smoother the process is going to be, the fewer surprises you're going to have. Understanding what the motivations are that are coming from the various constituents in the room. But by definition, you're working with a buying committee. Means everybody's got their own axe to grind. They all got their own motivators. They all got their own KPIs. They all got their own, bonus plans. And if you don't know what that looks like, you're not going to realize the landmine you just stepped on until, it goes off underneath you. So, again, you're speaking to the need for your sales force to be sophisticated, to not only be sophisticated in terms of what the product is and what the sales process is, but really understand, your buyer and your buyer's process and your buyer's organization and what's going on in the news and what's going on, under the covers. The more you can figure out, the fewer surprises you're going to have, the smoother the whole thing's going to go.
I haven't heard too many people referring to this as being multilingual, but it almost feels like you need to be able to speak IT and engineer and cybersecurity and finance and real estate, and depending on the different factors that are in there. So increasingly in larger organizations, we're going to see more and more vertical specialization, but in smaller companies, somehow you have to find people on your team that can be those unicorns that can have great ways of interacting with and totally understanding 4, 5, 6 different career paths.
Yeah, I think you're right. And, and I think, again, this is where you take advantage of the tools that are out there. You don't necessarily need to have 20 years experience in a given particular vertical if you have time to do the right preparation. Bring the right people into the room. Know where you're strong, know where you're not, know what you need. Walking in the door to mitigate your risk and to improve your odds of success. The smaller the organization, it's kind of funny. It kind of plays both ways, right? Smaller the organization, the more unicorns you need to have. Also, the smaller the team, the more effective the sales team can be. The less friction you have in the deal, the more efficient your communications are going to be. The fewer relationships you have to build. You walk into a large organization matched by a large organization, and now you have 20 people in a room, that are trying to match up and get a deal done. Just the end-way communication and relationships that have to be established, and figuring out your puts and calls and who has this and who's got that slide and what are you adding to the mix and what are you doing. The complexity of the machinery, if you will, can actually be as much a barrier as a benefit. The trade-off, of course, is that smaller orgs got to have more versatile, well-rounded, sophisticated, intelligent people that can take up 3 or 4 logical chairs at the table.
Yeah, a lot of times when people ask for what would I do or what does a strategy look like, a lot of times we're conceptualizing not just by location and industry, but size on that firm's size and size of who they're selling to. Is it similar size to them, or is it a more of a David Goliath situation? And like when you said there's 20 stakeholders on your side and 20 stakeholders on their side, that's a lot of permutations and combinations to figure out about what can go right and what can go wrong.
Right. Yeah, we don't tend to do that. Kind of regardless of who we're selling to, partially by nature of the fact that we're not a huge company. But even if we were, I would never advocate for that kind of approach. I don't think it's effective. I think it adds way too much bloat and way too much overhead. I would always rather build organizations that are more streamlined, that have fewer people, that are more well-rounded, that can carry the conversation and pivot and be able to adapt to various different forks in the road. I just think it's a much more efficient model.
Jon, what's something that you've tried to outsource with go-to-market over the years that you learned is just so core that you would never outsource again?
Demand gen, basically. I mean, for us, the majority of, again, it's all B2B. It's very relationship oriented. The way that we engage with customers up front is going to be much more efficient if we have those face-to-face relationship kinds of opportunities. That's where the demand gen is effective for us. And trying to do that through SDRs and other outsourced organizations, I've never found that to be terribly successful.
Yeah, it's fascinating that you bring that up, because a lot of times I get people that approach me that I think prematurely want to start a channel. They're not even articulating it as wanting to have a channel partner organization, but that's essentially what they're looking for. And so many times they just don't have the infrastructure to realistically support it. And they don't realize the risk of the brand damage that they can have if all they see is, oh, I can turn all this stuff into a variable cost instead of a fixed cost, and without having to make big investments. So yeah, it's really, really interesting to hear that that take, as well as on the importance of keeping that core. Final area I want to ask you about today, Jon, is when you look into your crystal ball, what do you think is going to change about growing a company like BNS when you think 12, 18, 24 months out from now?
What do I think is going to change about growing the company? Well, that's a eternity nowadays, right? I mean, I actually just got back from a big AI conference in Paris last week, and somebody was asking one of the panelists about where they were going to be 12 months from now. And this is a very reputable, extremely fast-growing company. And the guy turned around to the moderator and he said, "Well, a year ago, we were $30 billion of revenue smaller, and we weren't public, and so his point was the amount of change that their company has seen in the last year is the kind of thing that it used to take companies 10, 15, 20 years to get to. The world is just accelerating so fast. The velocity is increasing at such a rapid clip. I think it's kind of blowing through everybody's experience as far as what things to predict over what kind of time frame. I'm not intentionally hedging your question, but there are also enough variables in the world right now that are kind of very large variables, upcoming elections and wars and things like that, and the massive AI build out that's all predicated on this insane amount of demand that we're going to see, build it and they will come, kind of a thing. So it's a long way of saying that I don't think that we're going to see the wheels come off the bus. I think in the next 12 to 18 months for our company, we're going to see effectively more of the same. We've been doing an acquisition a year for the last 5 years. We're going to continue to march along at that same clip. I don't see anything dramatic changing in terms of the composition of our revenue or our customer behaviors or anything else necessarily. But now that I said that, I will immediately be proven wrong.
Do you see any risk mitigation or risk management that you're taking as a result of looking at some of these moratoriums? I like to try to keep these podcasts as evergreen as possible, but there was literally just another state today that put a moratorium out there in my local area in South Florida. There's a big meeting tomorrow for another huge hyperscale project. There's a lot of this going on, and there's a lot of talk on LinkedIn. Are you reasonably insulated from that at BNS in terms of the projects you do, or is there a significant amount that's dependent on this hyper aggressive pace of development continuing to go full steam ahead?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very, very tertiary moment in time. I think, the world kind of whipsaws back and forth. And right now we're in this, place where everyone's gone crazy in terms of build out. And now there's all of this noise about, inefficiencies in water usage. And, my power bills are going up, and it's becoming politically expedient to point at the big boogeyman, data center developers, and put a moratorium on that. And that'll work right up until the point that the world, or that the country, realizes that the largest component of our GDP growth was built last year square on the back of AI and infrastructure build out. You take that away, and we're actually in a recession as a country, right? So I don't see a replacement, for that GDP component of growth, and I think that we're actually just in a bit of a politically expedient place right now, where the news and the PR, has kind of painted the industry into a bit of a funky light. I don't think it's terribly accurate. I can get into lots of technical reasons, why, but I think that pendulum is going to swing again. And so, no, I don't see that as being kind of the existential threat. If I step back even a degree from where we are in the US, all that's going to do, if I'm wrong, and if the entire country locks down any kind of new data center development, all that means they're going to push it offshore. It doesn't mean that the opportunity is going to go away. It just means it's going to move. So, what's that mean? It means an awful lot of things. I don't think it's terribly likely, but I also don't think it's, in the grand scheme of things for us, I don't think it's going to be that impactful.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because by the nature of what you do, both on the defense side and on the commercial side, you're largely dealing with equipment and services that are provided inside of the center. You're not really getting involved in site selection and having to deal with community activists and everything. And same thing with me for the most part. I spent most of the 2010s working with colo operators, MSPs, and even what I do now is largely with technology and facilities related business models. So a lot of the complex political negotiations and a lot of the charge stuff that's making the current events is completely different. So yeah, it's a very, very different place to be, but really, really interesting outlook. And even just the whole idea of what you're looking to do with an acquisition every year for a relatively small company is a pretty interesting playbook to look at, and be really cool to come back and look at that 2, 3, 4 years from now and see how that's continued to evolve.
Well, 4 years ago, I didn't think I would be here, so I guarantee you 4 years from now, I won't be where I think I'll be. That's about the only thing I'm sure of.
And 4 years ago, nobody outside of IT really knew much about AI. I remember in like 2010s, I was doing some work for a fintech cloud company, and I was spending a lot of time explaining to people that AI was nothing to be feared, and they were already used to it with Waze and Netflix and Google Maps and everything. And now, pretty much everyone that's an IT user that has a phone has at least gotten comfortable with replacing Google or supplementing Google with the essentials and ChatGPT and stuff. So very, very different world.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, and I think, to me, that's part of the excitement of it. I mean, I don't know what I would do with myself if I was in an industry that didn't change very much, and it was the same kind of delivery model, same kind of industry, same kind of product line, selling to the same kind of customer. I mean, there's a place for that, and if that's attractive, that stability is great. I'm sure quality of life is a lot healthier for people who are in those kind of industries than mine. Work-life balance doesn't exist for me at all. But honestly, just based on my personality profile and everything else, that's kind of the only thing that would work for me, put it that way.
Yeah, no, I can appreciate that. Early on in my career worked in enterprise IT support and in Lower Manhattan, and an astonishing amount of projects couldn't start till after 4 or 5 p.m. in the afternoon and well into the middle of the night, and had to be done by 6 o'clock.
Exactly.
So different mindset, a lot of weekends.
Yep, for sure.
Jon, it's been really cool. I've really enjoyed our talk today. If someone wants to connect with you, learn more about BNS Networks, is LinkedIn a good place to start?
LinkedIn's a great place to start. LinkedIn.com/Jon Billow, Jon. I'm Jon, Jon, at boldnew.com, and our website is, boldnew.com.
Cool. Yeah, I'll make sure to include links to your profile and the company page and the website in the show notes for anyone that wants to reach out. But I've been speaking today with Jon Billow, who is the CEO and CRO of BNS based in Portland, Oregon. Thanks so much for joining me, Jon.
Thank you very much.
Most data center GTM teams are flying completely blind. 83% of your buyer's journey is happening before they even speak with someone from your sales team. The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is powered by DCSMI. We've studied over 1,900 industry leaders to build a diagnostic framework that identifies exactly why deals fall apart and revenue stalls. Stop guessing and start benchmarking. Subscribe now to our weekly Data Center GTM briefing at www.dcsmi.com/briefing. Again, that's dcsmi.com/briefing. BRIEFING.